Right. Lovely to have you guys with us tonight. And for those who are going to be watching us later, as I know there are some, our topic for this evening in our series of I'm a Cultural Jew, Get Me Out of Here is all about something which I think many of us have some exposure to, but perhaps have never spent the time to learn in a formal setting, which is comic books. So these days, I think very much these days in this generation, lots of people are familiar with comic books who wouldn't have been 20, 30 years ago. And that's partially because of the wild success of the films around the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which are now blockbuster films, which simply didn't exist a generation ago. But the fandom and the culture around comic books always did for a long time before. It's just really having a moment of high publicity right now. So many of us, I think for myself growing up, with films being pretty much the norm. I remember the X-Men films and many of the early MCU films, and it's just grown and grown since then. I think that we maybe underappreciate how much comics were a cult following for a long time, something that some people were really into, but most people weren't aware of at all. But whether or not it's a mainstream or a more subcultural element, the history of comic books has a lot to do with Judaism. And what I want to do this evening is take a look at some of the Jewish characters in comic books, some of whom are not very well known, some of whom are better known very recently, and some of whom perhaps you've never heard of at all. There's some who I'd never heard of at all before looking more into it myself. Before we do that, I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that it's not just about which characters are Jewish, although that's primarily what we're looking at this evening. It's actually also about who the people are who are putting together the stories of comic books. And I think that that's really important. Hopefully, can you see that window? Yeah, thank you. Trying to keep the windows from sliding. The picture that you see in front of you on our first slide here is actually of someone who is quite elemental to the creation of comic books, Jerry Siegel, who was an American Jewish man. This is him when he served in the military during the Second World War. And he, like many of the other people involved in early comic books, were Jewish, fairly secular. These weren't religious Jewish people, by and large, but they were people for whom, having seen the experience of the Second World War, there was an interest in trying to find a language to talk about what it meant to be a hero and how it is that you could find someone to step up and to speak out against evil. And the early comic books were really a result not only of kind of Jewish fantasy, but also Jewish practicality, which is that at the time, many jobs in publishing were quoted and discriminatory and kept a lot of Jewish people out. And the most accessible jobs in the publishing world, the most accessible part of the publishing world, were the kind of pulp magazines that people looked down on in official publishing, but that were very popular with kids and were usually very inexpensive and printed very poorly. And comic books grew out of those, from small strips, the comics and newspapers, to actually whole stories dedicated around usually heroes and villains and large-scale drama. And all of the people involved, Jack Kirby, Jerry Siegel, Stan Lee, all of them were Jews. All of them changed their names. None of those people's original names were what we know them by. All of them lived the kind of double identity that many of their characters lived. And both DC and Marvel, which are the two big houses of comic book creation, both had Jewish people at the helm in the beginning and throughout. And yet, many of the early and significant heroes and heroines and villains of the DC and Marvel universes weren't obviously Jewish in any way. Some of them have Jewish references which aren't too hard to hide. Superman, famously, when you look a little bit more into his story as a refugee, and his name, Kal-El, which sounds very Hebrew, and many other aspects of his kind of background, you get a feeling for the fact this is perhaps inspired by Jewish tradition and Jewish experience. But there's no place in which Superman is identified as Jewish. I think actually he becomes quite a good Methodist in middle America, like he's expected to. So the question that I'm more interested in, I think, is who are the characters who are explicitly identified as Jewish? Why and how are they labeled as Jewish, and what can we learn from them, and what does it say about Jewishness when we come across these characters and their stories? Most of them are pretty unknown. I think there's two who probably even the amateur comic book fan will have heard of, but most, I think, the case is not. So that's my goal. I'm going to do my best. I'm not an expert in comic books. I didn't grow up reading comic books. I'm not someone who's in the know, deeply, passionately involved in a lot of this stuff. So I've done my best to do my research. But disclaimer for those who know more than I do, apologies in advance for what inevitably I'll get wrong about some aspects of these stories. The first one that really struck me as very quite interesting is a heroine of some early Marvel comic books who mostly shows up in the 1980s and continues to since once in a while, who's named Sabra. Sabra, of course, being the name that we use in Hebrew to refer to someone who's a native Israeli, and it's based on the word sabar, which is the prickly pear cactus, which they felt was a good description of Israelis, prickly on the outside but gooey on the inside. And Sabra is a heroine who shows up in the Hulk comic books, mostly those published in the 1980s. She's a kind of recurring side character. We get some biographical details on her through the Hulk comics. Evidently, according to the story, she was born near Jerusalem, hence Sabra. She was raised on a kibbutz, which Mossad specifically set up for young people with mutant powers, which, as far as I know, doesn't actually exist. Her story and backstory is quite intricately linked with much of Israeli history and experience. One stage in her own story development, she has a son who dies in a terrorist attack. She often gets involved in kind of geopolitical conflict regarding Israel, as we'll see. A couple of the images I've managed to find refer to that. And ultimately, she ends up involved as kind of a minor character with the X-Men, because she fits into this universe of people with powers, mutants, as they're often known in the X-Men stories, which is part of Marvel, but also kind of exists on its own. So in a way, there's a tendency to see her much like Captain America is in a kind of American sense, which is this personification of a nation, right? Captain America being this ideal American, whatever that means. Sabra is perhaps the equivalent in some way for Israelis, or for the conception of Israelis. You'll notice her costume, although it varies dramatically, is always made up of the Israeli flag in some way, as you'd expect. She has a weirdly florid cape that always seems to be adorning it. I don't know if anyone's actually ever fought hand-to-hand combat, but you don't want to wear a cape. It's a bad idea. And yet they all do. The story of Sabra is developed only really in minor references. So got a couple panels I managed to find. This is from one of the early ones here. And you can see they give us a story in which Sabra is a police officer, and Hulk is coming. This is when Hulk must be bad to some degree, is coming, and she switches out of her normal identity as policewoman Ruth Ben Sarah and changes to Sabra, super heroine of the state of Israel, as you can see. I love they have a little editor's note they included in the panel about the word Sabra, and that it denotes a native-born Israeli. The name derived from an indigenous form of fruit, a prickly pear, possessed of a sweet interior and a spiny outer surface. You'll notice there's an attempt to try and have some Hebrew included. You also may notice that the Hebrew doesn't make any sense, and most of those, they're not even letters. But there's a really interesting kind of element of how she's portrayed and how her character is developed over time. These early drawings often have a very exaggerated kind of Star of David right at the bottom of her neck, along with the stripes of the flag repeated on her costume in various places. In later versions, that gets stylized in different ways. You can see here a slightly later one in which the Star of David becomes more like a brooch. And I'm not quite sure who this is she's fighting, to be honest. One of the X-Men, you can tell by the belt. But the characterization and drawing of her changes over time, as it does with all comic book stories and heroes, because different people draw different books. This is one of the older panels, one of the oldest panels actually, in which Iron Man comes to Israel. And the gentleman here is a character in the Marvel universe called the Arabian Night, who's kind of a vague hint and reference to Arab culture. And you can see Sabra here, depicted in very 70s fashion, describes herself like the spiny pear, the symbol of the Israeli people. And the Arabian Night is given dialogue saying that whatever her powers, he won't fight along a Jewess. And Iron Man asks, is it her nationality or the fact that Sabra's a woman that's bothering you, Knight? I don't know. I don't have this where this comes from, so I don't know what the next part of the story is. But it's just a really interesting window into how these comic books are being used in order to discuss the Israeli-Arab conflict and kind of identities around both Israeli and Arab romanticization and Orientalism in many ways, as most of these are written by Westerners. And Iron Man standing in for the West in some way in this little montage. Some more up-to-date versions, these are more modern ones of Sabra in which she's recurred. You can see many of the same elements are retained. Certainly the color scheme, the two stripes from the flag and the brooch type, cape type arrangement with the Star of David. And over here on the right, an even more up-to-date version, which looks very modern and which loses much of the color in reference to the flag and just looks a bit more like a spy. But you see different iterations of this occur in different time periods, but there's always enough things that you can identify who it is we're talking about. So she's quite an interesting one because she's so linked not to a Jewish identity necessarily, but to an Israeli one. And everything about her character is about the state of Israel, the way that Captain America is about America. Most of the others we'll look at are not the case, including the next one, which we're going to jump over to DC Comics for the character of Ragman. Ragman is very much a product of the diaspora. So this is DC Comics' take on the Golem story. And the backstory is that after the Golem fell back into dust when it failed to defeat whatever was sent against, the Jews of Prague in the 16th century then created a second Golem out of fabric, out of rags, which was kind of inhabited by different spirits and souls, and which was a hereditary title that a certain man in the community possessed. And the idea was that each generation there was a new ragman who helped protect the community, often depicted in patchwork, as you can see from these two. And the main person who's known as ragman is a guy named Rory Regan. His father, who was the previous ragman, was Jerzy Reginowitz, who shortened his name, and Rory is the first ragman to be born outside of Europe, and the first one to take on that title. It's also very linked in many ways to the cultural significance of the garment trade in Jewish communities in the Lower East Side of New York, the Shmata business, as many Jews knew it as. And as a result, this idea that his father owned a rag and tatters shop, and that in some way the kind of the business and link to the business and culture is linked to his own identity as a superhero is really interesting. You can see different drawings of the costume all kind of emphasize this patchwork nature of it and the tattered nature of the cape. We're going to see another superhero in Marvel who looks a lot like him, and it's interesting, they're almost two different takes on the same idea. But the mechanic of Ragman is all about the fact that when he kills someone, always evildoers, of course, their soul turns into a piece of fabric that gets added to the suit. So the suit is made out of the souls of people who he's killed that end up kind of sewn together gradually, which is a very heavy and dark take on it. There's been a recent revival of Ragman. This was art from the more modern version, which is starting to look more like a mummy in some way, with kind of wraps of fabric rather than the patchwork. But it's been something there's been many iterations of. And he's a very Jewish character, although there's not much discussion of it. There are hints in different places as to his Jewishness. Most of them connect to that story of the Golem originally. So these are two panels from Ragman comic books from the 90s. You can see, and hopefully you can see on the screen, that the depiction on the left, this panel, is someone who he killed. His soul is being absorbed into the suit and turns into a piece of fabric. And the Hebrew word emet is now kind of shown there on his pectoral, which is quite bulgy, which is the word for truth. And this links back to the Golem story, because the story of the Golem is that when Rabbi Yehuda Loew of Prague set up the Golem, he wrote the word emet in its forehead. In order to get rid of it, he erased the aleph, so it just said met, which means dead. So the link between truth and death is very closely connected to the Golem story. The whole idea of Ragman is basically a midrash on the Golem story. You can see in this later 90s version, they have even a little bit of language about the suit and how it works. And notice how different the patchwork looks now, much more tribal in some way. And they also tried to write the word emet, but they completely got it wrong. It's not even remotely correct in terms of what the Hebrew is meant to say there. And they even use a reference, right? A new shred of the ragman forever bonded by a protective Shem, right? Which is the Hebrew word for name. So they have this idea of kind of using the mythology of the golem, of names and of truth, and of the idea that you erase part of the name of truth in order to create death. That's all linked together with this character, which operates in the DC universe. There's lots of other depictions, and each one is different. And unfortunately, he's not someone who's got a major blockbuster movie yet. But it'd be interesting to see what that would look like and how they would continue the story, because it's someone who's quite a minor character in most of the DC comics. Speaking of minor characters, this is one that I actually didn't know about at all until doing this research. Who's a character named Wiccan, which is perhaps what you'd expect for a Jewish comic book character. But his name is William Kaplan originally, Billy Kaplan. The story is a bit strange, but basically he's of a later generation and grew up in a world in which the Avengers were kind of always around and celebrities in his world. And basically he was himself a big fan of the Avengers, grew up on the Upper West Side in New York City, raised by two Jewish parents. One's a cardiologist, one's a psychologist. They go to a Reform synagogue every week. He's gay. And his Jewish identity and his LGBT identity are combined together with the fact that he's a really big nerd for superheroes. And then one day he ends up kind of running into Scarlet Witch, who's one of the Avengers on and off, who somehow gives him powers. And he starts to kind of develop these powers, which are largely, as the name indicates, around magic, sorcery, magic, telekinesis, etc. Now, later stories reveal actually a bit more background, which is that the whole link with Scarlet Witch is more than just an accident. And actually, Scarlet Witch had a son who got reincarnated in the body of Billy Kaplan. So he actually is kind of her spiritual son, even though he's not her physical son. It gets very arcane. If you think Talmud is obtruse, try getting really deep into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But you can see they drop little hints in the comic books as to his Jewish identity. I found this one very interesting, that in a discussion with other heroes here, he uses the word bubkis, right, which proves bubkis. They have a little speech bubble for him saying. There's these little hints of his background, his kind of Jewish upbringing, his identity. There's ways in which he's one of the few openly gay superheroes is linked to his status as one of the few Jewish superheroes. And because he's of a kind of younger generation, there's many ways in which it's been used as a kind of symbol for kids today, because these younger iteration of superheroes are often very much the ones at the forefront of stuff that's being produced for kids, both comic books and multimedia. So he ends up in a relationship with and eventually married to another one of these younger generation of superheroes named Hulking, who's a relative of the Hulk, and they get married and live happily ever together. And you can see there's actually several comic books about them, Wiccan and Hulking. The depiction of him is always a bit strange, kind of a metal headband, red cape, a little bit kind of Doctor Strange-ish vibes. And actually there's one of the stories in which he becomes Doctor Strange's apprentice. For those following along, that's the film that's in the cinemas right now, is the second one about Doctor Strange. So it's a very live story, because it's a story that doesn't have a lot of background. He's a younger character. He's being developed now because they're drawing on all of these characters, so-called the Young Avengers. So you can see this panel here is often used as a description of the Young Avengers, which is this new generation. right? Some of which are their stories are being told now. So there's Hulking, which is Captain Marvel's son, and it was half Skrull. I was wrong, evidently not related to Hulk, but actually Skrull, which is an alien race. Anyway, Ant-Man's daughter, which is already referenced in the new Ant-Man films that have been out the last 10 years, that he has a daughter, that she kind of takes up his own mantle. Patriot, the grandson of the original Captain America, which is referenced by the Disney Plus series about Captain America and the Falcon. A younger Vision, who I think can time travel. A young female Hawkeye, which again was started to be developed, Kate Bishop, by the Hawkeye series on Disney Plus this past Christmas. A teenage mage who, though Jewish, calls himself Wiccan, which is the character we're looking at, and a speedster rather unimaginatively named Speed. So these kind of this newer generation, which many of us aren't as familiar with because they're only being developed now and being hinted at, we'll see more of them in the next 10 years as the Marvel Cinematic Universe develops, as Disney starts to develop more of these characters. And no doubt perhaps we'll see more of Wiccan, the Jewish mage, the gay Jewish mage. Just a lovely panel here kind of showing all these different pieces. And he's often depicted, I think, as being quite incompetent and being plunged into this whole thing rather fast. Moving on to one that's perhaps better known and a villain, although villain is questionable, is Magneto. Who, of course, is in some way the big bad of the X-Men storyline. For those who saw any of the X-Men films, you'll know Magneto first as Ian McKellen, and then later as, I forget who the other guy was that played him. He was very good at it. And Magneto, of course, his story is perhaps some way the most Jewish, because the story is a story about the Holocaust. Right? His born name is Max Eisenhardt. He later takes on a second name, Eric Lansher, but mostly he's known as Magneto. The background is that he's born in Nuremberg, Germany, before the war, to a middle-class Jewish family. His father, named Jacob, had been a highly decorated World War I veteran, got the Iron Cross, like many Jews who fought for Germany in the First World War. After Kristallnacht, the family moved to Warsaw, which is an unfortunate choice because eventually, of course, the Holocaust and the German invasion caught up with them there. They ended up in the Warsaw Ghetto. There's a really kind of devastating kind of series of comic books that tell the story of Magneto's background. And they describe how when they were liquidating the ghetto, his parents and him were brought to a location in which they were killed by a firing squad. And Magneto, as a child, managed to pretend to be dead while his parents were killed. He escaped later and was found in the forest and brought to Auschwitz. There's hints of this in the X-Men movies, by the way, in which they show some of these scenes. But in the story, he starts to discover his mutant powers. His power, of course, is magnetism. He can control and manipulate anything magnetic and magnetic fields, which allows you to do a lot of stuff, it turns out. He only discovered his power, according to the stories, because of an encounter with Joseph Mengele, and understanding that they kind of retell the history of Auschwitz and experimentation on Jewish prisoners as being about this kind of mutant story. So in the Magneto stories, you can replace the word mutant with Jewish 99% of the time, and this still is an accurate story. The background includes the fact that he became a Sonderkommando to avoid Mengele, which were the people who helped to bury and cremate the bodies. And it was that he realized that he was a mutant and his power kind of manifested through anger and rage in the camps. There's some really intense scenes. You can see how it's depicted in his background and this idea of kind of understanding his own power through the experience of being in the camps. Part of the story relates to a young woman named Magda, who's Romani, who he had a relationship with as a teenager before the war, and who he ends up in Auschwitz with during the war, and whom they escape together after he manages to use his power to break open the gates. Eventually, after they escape, Magneto and Magda, or at that point Max and Magda, end up kind of creating a life for themselves in the middle of the Carpathian Mountains. They have a daughter, and eventually the bad guys come and follow him and kill his daughter. And that's when Magneto kind of turns into a villain in the stories, is when he realizes that he can't save his daughter and that people will never accept him as a mutant. And he sees lots of echoes of his experience of Nazis in the views of non-mutant people towards mutants, and discrimination, desires to register them, to round them up, to put them in camps, etc. So there's lots of sorry, Andrea.
How popular are these publications? I mean, how do people or youngsters associate this story with their lives? Is it approved of, or do they just accept it as another story, part of the history, nothing special?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because there's so many stories. The nature of comic books is that they rarely agree with each other. Each time the story is told, it's often a little bit different. But you can see the way in which the character of Magneto has been very relevant because he's been very significant to the X-Men films that have come out in the last 10 years or so. Particularly, there's been a series of X-Men films called X-Men First Class, which are actually really well made. Encourage you to watch them, which are about the kind of older generation of the X-Men when they were young. So it involves kind of Charles Xavier, who's the X behind X-Men, when he was a young man at Cambridge. And at the same time, it's telling the story of Magneto when he was a young man after surviving Auschwitz. And these are clearly stories which are very relatable. The crux of the X-Men story is about this question of the different outlooks between Magneto and Charles Xavier on what to do with mutants. Are the mutants better than humans because they're different? Will the humans ever accept the mutants? How do they respond to discrimination? It's a very, that sense, it's a very kind of live question about how do we deal with racism? How do we deal with racists? Can you go too far in defending yourself and worrying about protecting yourself for the future? Magneto often goes a bit too far, but that's his whole gimmick in some ways. Kind of, he's the foil to Charles Xavier. He's really not a villain per se. He's much more of what we might call an anti-hero. And you can see these different depictions of him in different comic books, all kind of range over, a variety of styles, some more villainous than others. Just really want to point out what I think is probably one of the most interesting bits of art I've seen around Magneto, which is this image on the left, a cover of one of the books devoted to his story. And it depicts the traditional helmet that he's seen often wearing, which has this kind of frame around his face. The idea of the helmet was supposedly to prevent him from having his mind read by Professor X, Charles Xavier. But the helmet is made out of the barbed wire of Auschwitz in this image, which I just find really, really striking. There's ways in which comic books can tell a story through pictures that is very hard to describe in words. And that's part of the power of it, actually, is the kind of evocative nature of how these stories are told through imagery. We say pictures are worth 1,000 words, but in some way you can really see that when you see a comic book done well. But better or worse, Magneto is probably the most famous and most well-known Jewish character in the comic book world, certainly in the Marvel universe. And that's not always a good thing, because he himself becomes an extremist, a radical, a violent villain, sometimes more so than others. And it's complicated, but it's also very sensible considering his background and his experience of the Holocaust.
Thank you. I've got to go now, but I'll watch the rest.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll catch you later. One that's a bit more modern, that I think a lot of younger people have definitely connected to, is Kitty Pryde, who is a Marvel character, one of the X-Men as well. A lot of this seems to center on the X-Men. She's known by a variety of other names: Catherine Pryde, Shadowcat, Sprite, etc. And she's one of the X-Men who, as a young girl, was brought into contact with Professor X and his early academy. Again, if you've seen the X-Men films, you'll see the depiction of a kind of school for mutants. She's one of the people who's very central to that in an early day. She ends up being more involved over time. She's kind of a recurring character in the X-Men. And she's known for having a particularly strong Jewish identity, which isn't necessarily obvious from any part of her characterization or her background, but it shows up quite a bit in her own narrative and storytelling, often because of her kind of connection to Magneto and the similarity perhaps between them. Her power is being able to phase through solid surfaces, So you can see her here kind of walking through walls. A hard thing to draw, I imagine. And I think maybe there's some commentary there, perhaps, on kind of Jewish identity and being able to disguise oneself and changing through one thing to another. But she's quite well known as being prominently a Jewish character. She often talks about it. There's a clip here. I've just blown up the bottom right panel from this bit, which she says, "I am Jewish, I'm a mutant, and I want people to know who and what I am." And the smaller bit, which is very hard to read, but is her kind of telling this backstory of having a boyfriend when she was young who made an anti-Semitic comment, and it made her really angry. And she realized then how important it is not only to embrace her mutant identity, but also her Jewish identity. Again, very similar to Magneto in that way, in which Jewishness and being a mutant are linked hand in hand as both kind of disadvantaged peoples who are discriminated against and who perhaps need to defend themselves more than others. The various depictions of her are dramatically different, and she's shown up in literally 40 years of comics, so you can find any number of different versions. But even in more modern ones, such as this one, you can see they make a point to include her Jewishness through symbols like the Star of David necklace. This is a panel from a very modern X-Men comic book. And in recent times, because there's been an internet kind of following of Jews who are really into Kitty Pryde because she's known as being a Jewish heroine, the most modern takes on a lot of these stories, which have gotten really strange and involve some kind of sci-fi, Baroque, steampunk vibe, which I don't understand, have really embraced this Jewishness of her. And this is one that's only a few years ago, in which you can see she's lighting Hanukkah candles and saying the blessing. They include the beginning part of the blessing in transliteration and then a translation of it. As usual, they get some things wrong, like the fact that she would have said the blessings before she lit the first one, not after lighting the first one before lighting the second one. Also, she would have lit the shamash first, which remains unlit in this drawing. But we can't have everything. But even just having a comic book in which you see a character lighting a menorah, it's profound in some way. I'm not sure who the man is meant to be over on the right. I imagine her father or something, kind of a ghost or image of, connecting with her past. But, the whole point of many of this is that representation matters. If you're Jewish and you read comic books and you see Jewish characters doing Jewish things, there's something very validating about that that's really important. And that's why it's such an important part of any art form, really, whether it's music or film or comic books. But certainly we see the fact that many people, especially young people, relate very, very passionately to the stories of comic book universes, not always comic books themselves, but these days mostly the films that are created from them. Not only films, though. Thanks to Disney buying Marvel, a huge amount of it has recently been kind of television production. And just this past couple months, you may have heard of or seen or perhaps watched the Disney series about perhaps now the most famous Jewish superhero, which is Moonknight. Anyone, did you see all the fuss about Moonknight? Yeah. I don't know if you watched it. Is 6 episodes on Disney Plus. It's pretty good. But Moonknight is one of the best known Jewish comic book heroes, perhaps. In some way, he's kind of Marvel's answer to Ragman, right? You have a similar kind of vibe in the way that he's drawn and the kind of backstory. The backstory is interesting because it links not only to his Jewish identity, but also to his experience of having dissociative identity disorder, in which what's formerly known as multiple personality disorder, in which he has multiple personalities that all kind of play into his identity as a superhero. But his main and primary personality is as Mark Spector, whose father was a rabbi who escaped from Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia, grew up in Chicago, very often very depicted as very Jewish as a child, and ironically probably the most Jewish in some way, with the depictions of him wearing kippah or his father and his rabbinic establishment and whatever else. The story, the normal story, is that later in life he becomes a mercenary, a Marine, and then a mercenary. And after a mission goes wrong in Egypt, He's bleeding out on top of a statue or a temple dedicated to the Egyptian god Khonshu, who is the god of the moon, and the protector of travelers at night. And the idea is that Khonshu basically promises him that he'll protect him and bring him back to life if in exchange he becomes his avatar and fights for him and protects the vulnerable and whatever else. So in addition to the other personalities that already inhabit his body, he now also adds that he's possessed by an Egyptian deity, which is a weird position for a guy who's raised in a pretty Jewish environment to be in. I imagine Pesach Seder would have been very awkward talking about the Egyptian gods if you're actually possessed by one. But as far as I know, the comics never deal with that instance specifically. You can see the different depictions of him, often in kind of typically white flowing garments, cape, the symbol of the moon, obviously very prominent because of his connection with Khonshu. He often uses little moon-shaped daggers and things to throw. In addition to having a cape that's shaped like a moon, they really go all in on the moon. Obviously, that's the main imagery. There's a lot of really dark imagery around him. He's kind of a Batman type figure in some way, himself a bit dark, troubled, not necessarily very relatable, doesn't have a lot of friends, but ultimately is trying to help people who are vulnerable and who need his help, which makes him obviously someone who we want to root for. Couple of panels here, not all of which are easy to read, I realize, but just to show the ways in which Jewishness shows up in some of the comic book versions. There's this image here of him holding a Torah scroll. Again, the Hebrew is not Hebrew. It doesn't make any sense. Some of it just looks like alien language. They tried to scroll on the side of it. But it describes him in kind of having a strong feelings around encountering a Torah scroll. Right, he talks here about, he's describing to someone that he's not on the Avengers Hanukkah card list. And he says he thinks he needs to meet more Jewish superheroes. There's kind of a meta awareness of the fact that he is unusual in his Jewishness. This panel to the right, which is very hard to read, I realize it's very small, but it describes him talking about his father, the rabbi, and how he kind of described the Jewish people as being a result of persistence rather than violence, and how uncomfortable as a result he feels with violence being part of his life and his work. In about 2016, I think, there was a reboot of Moonknight in which the story was retold. And it was written very interestingly, and this is a bit of a nerdy trivia fact, but it was written by a guy named Max Bemis, who's actually a musician and a singer-songwriter who was the frontman of the punk band Say Anything, who often talked about his Jewishness in his band lyrics. And he was hired by Marvel to rewrite the Moon Knight comic books. He did 2 of them. They're really excellent. But he provides actually a lot of new content and a lot of new background there about what happened. What was the trauma that triggered Moon Knight's or Mark's DID, his dissociative identity disorder? And it all connects to his experience, actually, according to this version of the story, with this guy who's depicted here in the center, a rabbi named Yitz, who was someone he really looked up to as a young boy and who was his father's friend. And it turns out in the story that actually Yitz was a Nazi named Ernst who had fled to America pretending to be Jewish. And there's this really kind of very dark, extreme, traumatic kind of experience of betrayal that comes from that, and it absolutely breaks him. And as a result, he kind of ends up living the rest of his life in a fractured personality, which is a really interesting and bizarre take on it. These pages are from that new version, which is only a few years old, and the Jewishness really becomes central to the story in that version. Interestingly, perhaps the Disney Plus show, which perhaps you've watched, really downplays the Jewishness in some way. There are references to it. Particularly, there's a scene that was much discussed, at least in my social media feeds, of him going to Shiva for his mother and throwing a kippah on the ground and then feeling really guilty about it and kissing it. And there's an element of which they tried very hard to depict the Jewish identity for him. But the fact that his own story as Moon Knight was not connected at all to his Jewishness or to this background with his father and his friend, the rabbi, and whatever else, it's a bit of a shame, actually, because I think it's quite a compelling story to tell. And he's one of the rare comic book Jews who's actually depicted kind of living an observant Jewish life, right? We talked about many Jews who are identified as Jews, but in secular ways, even Sabra. But this is one of the few instances where you see a religious Jewish life depicted in these stories. And I was really hoping that we'd see that in the Disney Plus show as well, which we didn't really. Last one for me is a very modern one, and trying to kind of update in some way. This is a one-off. This is now, the way comics have been published is changing. It's no longer small volumes that are picked up every day for a few pennies. Now it's much more graphic novels, which are published basically as a one-off book rather than a series. And DC produced only about a year ago, I think 2021 it came out, a new story in Gotham City, which of course is where Batman is, about a girl named Willow Zimmerman, who goes by the name Whistle. The story is that she's 16. Her mother, Naomi, teaches Jewish studies at the local university, but the job does include health insurance, very American, unfortunately. And Naomi needs chemotherapy. Her neighborhood's kind of in trouble and no one seems to care about it. People are getting hurt. The city is ignoring her neighborhood. So she starts to get involved in kind of local community organizing, and eventually also gets a sidekick in the form of her Great Dane named Leibowitz, which you can see in the picture. That's Leibowitz there. And together they start to fight corruption in the city. She gets superpowers eventually through fighting a villain named Killer Croc, who looks like a giant crocodile. But ultimately, it's not so much a story about superpowers as it is about kind of bravery and courage. Her Jewishness is quite central to the story. In the book, there's many depictions of her going to synagogue to kind of think and contemplate, as you can see on the left-hand side here. A depiction of kind of a classic New York Lower East Side synagogue. The story is kind of a new one, and presumably there'll be more of it told in different media. But 16-year-old Willow Zimmerman is ultimately a really interesting kind of piece of this broader story of how Jewish characters show up in comic books. And unusually, she seems to be a heroine who is simply a heroine, unlike many of the others, which are really complicated, Magneto being the most prominent example, but almost all of them are complicated hero stroke villains or anti-heroes. There's something very wholesome about the way in which Marvel is trying to sell a younger audience, perhaps, on a depiction of a young Jewish girl who's just trying to help pay for her mom's medical bills, which I think is interesting turn. She's the first Jewish superhero to be introduced in probably 40 years, and I imagine a very purposeful choice on their part. This was introduced around the same time as the character of Miss Marvel, aka Kamala Khan, who's the first Muslim female superhero, and whom a Disney show is coming out about shortly, I believe. And there's a way in which actually these two comic book houses are being much more thoughtful about representation and about positive representation. What would it look like to depict all the good aspects of a teenage Jewish girl and how she becomes a hero. And as far as I can tell, I haven't actually read the book, but as far as I can tell, this is a much more positive take on how Jewishness plays into that than many of the other examples, which focus on being a victim, on suffering, on the Holocaust, or on a kind of very flat depiction of Israel, as with Sabra. So I've lost my controls. There they are. So to bring it back, and I don't know if anyone who's with us here has questions, but I think it's really, really interesting, not just to look at how the comic books that we know them, how Marvel and DC were founded by Jews, how Jews were involved in the early days, how it became a Jewish way of telling stories, but also, how are Jews represented in these stories? These are probably, these 6 or 7 that we looked at, probably the most prominent examples. And most of them are still pretty minor characters, despite Moonknight getting his own TV show and Magneto being very prominent in the X-Men movies. Most of the others are extremely minor. So I'm curious, any thoughts, questions from you guys about what you think about Jewish superheroes? Yeah, Nick.
So my question was, are other faiths sort of also represented in amongst the superheroes? Are there as many Muslim or Roman Catholic or Hindu faiths amongst the superheroes?
I mean, I think there's probably not, to be honest. I think, although we might lament, oh well, there's not much Jewish representation. I think there's probably a lot more Jewish representation than there is of, say, Muslim or Hindu or Sikh communities. I think that is changing, right? And as I said, I think you see that with this character of Miss Marvel, being a young Muslim woman, same time that DC is exploring this idea of whistle. And I think that there'll be others too, hopefully, because the world is definitely moving in a direction in which they're trying to address the lack of representation. I do think there's also a piece in which religion, if these are identities about religion, was never really that important to most of the other comic book heroes either. Batman doesn't go to church, right? There's no element of those stories which is explicitly religious. But I think that's been part of the problem, is a recognition that the Jewishness of a character or the Muslimness of a character is not just about religion, but also about a kind of cultural background, about values, about what they're fighting for and why. And that's perhaps what these studios are catching on to a bit better now. And hopefully will continue to do so.
So if you have cultural superheroes, are we going to see a Ukrainian superhero one day, do you think?
I mean, I think there's already been the language of superheroes is something that people turn to very fast. I remember in the first days of the war, one of the things I saw immediately was an image that someone had made of basically they took Captain America and changed the colors of the shield and the symbol on the shield and put Zelensky's face on it, and it said Captain Ukraine, and it was going around on social media very prominently. I don't know if anyone else saw in the first kind of week of the war. And to me, that shows that actually it's a very natural impulse at the moment to turn towards superhero stories as a way to deal with conflicts. And to oversimplify things, right? The good guy versus the bad guy. It's a story we all want it to be, and in reality, things are usually more complicated.
Presumably, we'll see Putin there as the evil man.
Who's to say? Someone's probably writing it right now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were just talking about all these representations of Jews that you've shown on as heroes. Are there equally examples where they're demonized in comics, or not so much?
I mean, shockingly, not so much, I think. There was a big controversy about a year ago with a Muslim artist who was doing a lot of the drawings for a Marvel comic book that featured Kitty Pryde and I think one of the others in it. And he had embedded kind of secret symbols into it, which were all references to Quran verses that were said negative things about the Jews. Someone kind of realized this, and Marvel pulled the book immediately and whatever else. But that was a really strange and unusual example. Most of these characters are, I mean, Magneto is definitely demonized as, it's an overreaction. He's an extremist, whatever. But I don't know that it's necessarily a demonization of his Jewishness. I think the fact that Jews were so prominent in setting up the way in which these stories were told means that there's a certain kind of just safety net. These stories always prefer the characters who come from vulnerable backgrounds, who fight for the oppressed, the underdog. There's a certain kind of sentiment that's very natural. What I wonder, and I don't know as much, is how much, whether we have already seen or will see in the future, ways of telling the Palestinian story through comic books that will make Jews into the bad guys by virtue of Israelis into the bad guys. I'm kind of surprised there's not more of that, actually, because it almost naturally feels like a story that would lend itself to this media, but it might just be that it hasn't gotten there yet. So I wouldn't be surprised if we do see that story and that attempt to try and figure out who's the good guy and who's the bad guy played out in comic books in some way. But I haven't seen it yet.
So it seems like it's more of a function of its its own origin story of DC and Marvel playing out through the characters. They're all refugees or had come refugee mindset.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think as time goes on, and it's developing away from the 1940s kind of original mindset of the genre. I wonder if that'll change. or whether it become harder to tell Jewish stories as a result, or whether the Jewish stories it's telling will be different. Certainly, the example of Willow, that's only come out last year, is a really different kind of Jewish story than that of Magneto. And I think that's probably a good thing, because it means that we're able to tell new Jewish stories that aren't just about refugees, aren't just about suffering, aren't just about Holocaust. But I do think that because that's how so many of them started, it probably gives us some safety, perhaps, within the media.
Yes, it's more relatable for the new generations.
Yeah.
It's already grandparents or great-grandparents were exposed to those experiences, and trying to find ways of making it more relevant today. Yeah,
absolutely. Good. Well, I mean, I encourage you, if you haven't read or come across any of these ladies and gentlemen who are heroes and villains and whatever else, to do a bit more reading on them. Some are easily more available than others, but you'd be surprised if you go to your local comic book shop and poke around how often Jews can be found on the shelves. And I think that's a good thing. I think actually there's more Jewish representation than I realized. And I'm pleased to see there's more Jewish representation in newer stuff. And I think it's a really good way of connecting with our own history in the comic book industry and continuing to make it a relevant part of our storytelling into the future. Because the whole method of comic books is really a very Jewish one, which is to take a story and retell it over and over and over and over, and maybe change some of the details and have different interpretations. And, well, some people say it was this and some people say it was that. There's something about that feels very Jewish. It feels like, midrash with paint and with panels. And I think there's something in it for us to be able to tell our own stories into the future as well. And I'm pleased to see more Jewish representation of that storytelling technique as well as Jewish characters. Thank you guys for joining me this evening. I know there's a Shiva this evening, which some might be aiming to go to. So I think we will leave it there. But I appreciate you coming along on the journey with me. And if you want me to send you the names or info on any of these characters, do let me know.